Let's begin by understanding one of the most iconic scenarios in game theory, the prisoner's dilemma. Imagine this. You and your partner are arrested at the scene of a minor crime. The police suspect you were involved in a larger crime, but they lack evidence. You're placed in separate interrogation rooms with no chance to communicate. Each of you has two choices: confess or stay silent. The consequences depend on what you both decide. If you both stay silent, you each get a 1-year sentence for the minor crime. If one of you confesses and the other stays silent, the confessor goes free while the silent one receives a 5-year sentence. If you both confess, you each get a 3-year sentence for the larger crime. This scenario sets up a classic tension. Do you trust your partner and cooperate by staying silent, or betray them to reduce your own punishment? Let's see how this plays out mathematically. Here, we visualize the possible outcomes in a game outcome table. Each cell shows the penalties for both players based on their choices. For example, if both confess, each receives a -3 payoff, representing a 3-year sentence. If player 1 confesses while player 2 denies, player 1 gets a 0 payoff, freedom, and player 2 gets a 0 payoff, freedom, -5 payoff, 5-year sentence. What's critical here is understanding that the best outcome for both players collectively is to stay silent. Yet, the game's structure incentivizes both to confess, because betrayal guarantees a better individual outcome if the other stays silent. This is a cornerstone of game theory. Individual rationality often conflicts with collective benefit. Let's explore the concept of a dominant strategy, a choice that yields the best outcome regardless of what the other player does. In the prisoner's dilemma, confessing is always the dominant strategy. Why? Because it minimizes your potential losses. If your partner confesses, you avoid the harshest penalty by also confessing. If your partner stays silent, confessing ensures you go free. However, this leads to both players confessing, landing each with a worse outcome than if they had cooperated and stayed silent. This dilemma illustrates the tension between short-term self-interest and long-term mutual gain. Now, let's consider what happens when you attempt collusion, an agreement to cooperate. The challenge is that this game is a simultaneous move game, meaning you can't communicate or enforce agreements during the decision-making process. You must rely on trust that the other person won't act selfishly. Here's the problem. If you announce that you'll stay silent, you hand over all the leverage to your partner. They can maximize their gain by confessing, leaving you with the harshest penalty. Bluffing is an option, but it introduces significant risk. Without trust or enforcement, collusion often fails because self-interest drives players to exploit the situation. Imagine your partner signals their intention to stay silent. Rationally, you may choose to confess and secure freedom, exploiting their trust. However, this approach can damage relationships in repeated games where trust and reputation matter. It also increases the overall penalties for both players if repeated, highlighting the long-term inefficiency of exploitation. This is why understanding incentives is critical. Systems that align individual incentives with group outcomes, like enforceable contracts or repeated interactions, are more likely to foster cooperation and prevent exploitation. Why is this dilemma so significant? It's more than a theoretical exercise. The prisoner's dilemma applies to real-world scenarios such as business competition. Companies face similar dilemmas in pricing wars. Lowering prices may attract customers, but can hurt profitability if competitors retaliate. Environmental agreements. Countries negotiating carbon emissions limits face incentives to defect for economic gain, jeopardizing collective climate goals. Trade wars. Nations. Imposing tariffs risk mutual losses, but may still defect to protect domestic industries. These examples show the dilemma's relevance in contexts where trust, communication, and enforcement mechanisms are limited. To mitigate the risks of exploitation and collusion failure, trust-building mechanisms are essential. For example, in business, long-term partnerships often include shared data and revenue-sharing agreements to align incentives. In international relations, institutions like the UN or WTO enforce cooperation through penalties for non-compliance. In interpersonal relationships, repeated interactions help build trust and reduce the risk of betrayal. The key takeaway? Creating structures that reward cooperation and penalize defection is critical to overcoming the prisoner's dilemma.